So believe it or not, when we read that story in chapel at PCC, it went great. So for the past few weeks, we've been talking about stewardship. We've been talking about money, and we've been talking about what we do with that. And then you realize that even though I don't consider myself to be wealthy, financially speaking, compared to others in the community, it's important to remember that globally and historically speaking, I'm incredibly wealthy. You know, when Jesus talks to us about you don't need to worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear, that's not really a worry for us. If we worry about what we're going to eat, we worry about how many calories it has in it. If we worry about what we're going to wear, we worry if those clothes match or if they fit. I don't think most of us are worrying about whether or not we get to eat today or whether or not we have to go around naked. That worry for us is a little different than the worry that Jesus was talking about back then. Well, the worry that he's talking about, we did talk about it a couple of weeks ago, because that part about the flowers and the birds and the not worrying, that was the part that we talked about a few weeks ago in the Gospel of Matthew. This week in Luke, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to focus more on the first part of this section of Scripture. The part that begins with inheritance and then goes on to a parable that Jesus tells. It begins with a man in the crowd coming up to Jesus and telling him, or saying to him, Jesus, tell my brother how to divide the inheritance with me. I don't know if y'all have ever had to deal with inheritance before, but it can get messy. Inheritance can get real messy. Whether there is $1 at stake or $100 million at stake, it can get messy. I've never been in the middle of it personally, but I have seen it up close quite a few times. And generally, when the discussion about inheritance gets messy, it's not because someone didn't get anything. It's usually because someone thinks they didn't get enough. It's not about not getting anything. It's about not getting enough. So Jesus, if you notice, doesn't settle that inheritance dispute for the guy. He just goes right on and uses this as a teachable moment, as an opportunity to talk about greed in the form of a parable. And that's a good reminder for me, because when I consider myself to be not wealthy compared to others, it's that greed that makes me think that I'm not wealthy. When in fact, if I look at it from a global point of view, from a historical point of view, I got plenty of stuff. So we're going to talk about this parable. Before, when we've talked about parables, I have offered to you C.H. Dodd's definition of what a parable is. Does anybody remember? Let's try again then. C.H. Dodd says that a parable at its simplest is a metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, so strange as to arrest the hearer in its hearing and to tease the mind into active thought. I knew you would remember that. Basically what C.H. Dodd says is, a parable takes what we know and it takes what we don't know, slams them together, and leaves us to sift through the debris of the collision to try to figure out what it is all about. So, in this parable, Jesus tells a story about a rich man who has a bountiful harvest. And after the bountiful harvest, the rich man says to himself, I'm going to tear down my barns that I already have, build bigger barns to store all of my goods and all of my grain, so that then I can sit back and say to myself, well done, self, eat, drink, and be merry. And God says to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you, and you can't take it with you. So I was trying to figure out what a modern day example of this parable might be, or a modern day parallel to this parable might be. And the first thing that came to mind was Charles Dickens' book, A Christmas Carol, and the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. It's not really modern. He wrote that in the 1800s. I mean, it's more modern than the Gospel of Luke, but it's still not very modern. So I realized then, well, they're constantly updating that story and retelling that story again and again and again. And my favorite version of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol that has been updated was in 1988 with Bill Murray, Scrooged. He plays Frank Cross, the Ebenezer Scrooge character. But then I started thinking, well, that's 30 years ago. Maybe that's not really modern either. And I don't really like to mix up the holidays. We're not really in a Christmas time, so it's not really a good time to use Christmas stories as an example. But it is Labor Day weekend. So, Weekend at Bernie's. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's not modern either, but it's 29 years old. So it's more modern than Scrooged, right? And it takes place on Labor Day weekend. Okay, so if you haven't seen Weekend at Bernie's, bearing in mind that it is 29 years old, so you've had plenty of opportunities, and it only got like 59% on a rating on Rotten Tomatoes, I'm not going to worry about spoiling it for you. I'm going to tell you all about it, okay? So the setting is a New York insurance company. And there are these two low-level employees who are going over the finances, and they find a discrepancy in the finances. It looks as though someone has been continually paying out on one life insurance policy when it should have already been completely paid out. So they bring it to the attention of the big man, the boss, the CEO, Bernie himself. Bernie is a single New York businessman with more money than he knows what to do with. So they bring it to the attention of Bernie, and Bernie says, "Good work, guys. I can't believe you found this. This is great. We need to figure out what to do about this. I'll tell you what, it's Labor Day weekend. I'm having a big party at my place out in the Hamptons. Why don't you come and join me, and we'll talk about what we need to do with this problem." Great. What they don't know is that this is part of Bernie's plan to have them killed. You see, Bernie is the one who is committing the fraud. Bernie, who has more than enough money, is taking even more money in for himself. And so he calls a hitman to have them killed. Stages it to be like an elaborate murder-suicide. But the hitman works for the mob, and the mob is in cahoots with Bernie, and they decide Bernie is the liability. So instead of killing the two low-level employees when they show up at his house in the Hamptons for the Labor Day weekend party, the mob kills Bernie instead. The two guys get there, shocked to find a dead Bernie in front of them, and just as they're about to call the police, the Labor Day weekend party starts. And everybody starts coming in, and because Bernie's wearing sunglasses, they just assume he's still alive. And so the two keep up the charade for the whole weekend. Great movie. I don't know how the Academy skipped it over. Now, I know that's not an exact parallel to the parable. There are some significant differences. For one, the rich man in the parable doesn't do anything illegal like Bernie does. And we don't know for a fact that he dies, but we know that God says he's going to die really soon. But outside of that, there are some striking similarities. There's a rich man who has more than he needs and is planning on getting even more. That's the story, right? He already has barns for grains and for goods. He's going to tear them down to build new ones. It's also a rich man who is all by himself and thinks only of himself. If you look in the parable, you will notice the only pronouns that the rich man uses are personal pronouns. I, myself. No consideration of anyone else. He may not have anyone else in his life. Just like Bernie. And when God says to the rich man, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you," what do you have to show for yourself then? That question implies that when he dies, nobody's going to miss him. When Bernie dies, he was dead, and everybody just assumed he was alive. That's how little they missed him. This parable that Jesus tells us opportunity for Jesus to talk to the people about greed. Now, just as the parable made me think of Weekend at Bernie's, it also made me think of a story in Genesis about Joseph and the famine in Egypt. Does this sound familiar to anyone? You know, Joseph goes down into Egypt, sold into slavery, and while he is there, Pharaoh has a dream. And he is called upon to interpret Pharaoh's dream for him. And Pharaoh's dream says that there is going to be a famine in the land of Egypt. And in order to prepare for the famine, they have to prepare by saving up grain, by building storehouses for grain, so that when the famine hits, there will be plenty of food to go around. This is the point where our story changes. Where the biblical story, where the story of the Hebrew people, where the story of God's people, our story changes. According to Walter Brueggemann, up to this point, God's entire story has been about abundance. God has always and will always provide, always wants abundance for us. But when the famine strikes in Egypt, the people become afraid that there's not enough to go around. This is where the myth of scarcity is introduced into our story. So I don't know if y'all know what happened, but when the famine hit, you see, Pharaoh didn't just dole out the food. Now, even though Pharaoh had been going around collecting the food that everybody has been growing, not paying for it, just collecting it through Joseph, when the people came and needed something to eat, Joseph said, okay, what do you got? And they gave them all of their money. That first year of the famine. The second year of the famine, they come back to Joseph and say, we have no more money. Joseph says, what do you got? And they give all their livestock in exchange for grain so they can survive. In the third year of the famine, they say, we have no money, we have no livestock. Joseph says, what do you got? And they sell themselves and their land into slavery so that Pharaoh could have it all. Fear of not having enough led them to give away all that they had so they could just survive. They were worried there was not enough. Pharaoh, who had more than enough, said, enough is not enough, and wanted it all. Here's the thing. There was plenty of food to go around. It says that they stored up grain beyond measure, and yet still the people were afraid there was not enough to go around. The story of God's abundance is a story of God having enough for everyone to go around if they just shared. Brueggemann wrote this article about 20 years ago called The Liturgy of Abundance and the Myth of Scarcity. And in it he says, we who are now the richest nation are today's main coveters. We never feel that we have enough. We have to have more and more, and this insatiable desire destroys us. Whether we are liberal or conservative Christians, we must confess that the central problem of our lives is that we are torn apart by the conflict between our attraction to the good news of God's abundance and the power of our belief in scarcity. A belief that makes us greedy, mean, and unneighborly. We spend our lives trying to sort out that ambiguity. And we can trace that fear that has entered into our story all the way back to Genesis, when some people were afraid that they wouldn't have enough, and one person was afraid that he already didn't have enough. God calls the man in the parable a fool. I don't think that he is a fool because he is wanting to prepare for and plan for his future. That's not why he's a fool. In fact, it's smart to prepare for and plan for a future. When we plan for a future, it makes the future better for others around us. That's not why he was a fool. He was a fool because he only planned for his own future and no one else's. Jesus says this man wasn't rich towards God. I don't think planning for the future is what keeps us from being rich towards God. Planning for the future at the expense of the future of others does not make us rich towards God. I don't think this parable is about saying that we shouldn't be rich. We shouldn't have possessions. It is when we are rich at the cost of other people's poverty that we are not rich towards God. The man in the parable is a fool because he thought only of himself. His plan for the future included only himself, and he was afraid there would not be enough to go around, so he kept there from being enough for others. He was a fool because his wealth was at the expense of others. May we as individuals, and may we as a church, not be so foolish. Amen.